Hi, and welcome to the Caterpillar Cross Stitch YouTube channel. My name is Ford, and this week I'm going to be showing you one of the ways to cross-stitch on fabric that was not intended for cross-stitching. This method is called water-soluble canvas. So before I just jump right in, if I've ever taught you anything in one of my videos, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel, like this video, and when we're done, leave me a comment. It makes a really big difference for me, and I'd appreciate it if you take a second and do it. So soluble canvas comes from a few different manufacturers, but the one that I'm going to be using today is by DMC. And you can see that it comes in a package like this, and the piece that I've got is 8 by 8.5 inches, 20 by 22 centimeters. It's not particularly big. And if you look closely, you can see that it's got a bunch of little holes in it. And those holes are just like the holes in a piece of Aida. And in fact, in the case of this piece, they're even spaced the same as the most common kind of Aida, at 14 holes per inch. So if we use those holes to make cross stitches, we're going to make 14 cross stitches per inch. So what I'm planning to do today is to just cross stitch a little heart on this vest. This is the vest that we loan to new volunteers in a department that I volunteer with, and we like to embellish the vests a bit so that it's not obvious that they're new. Using water-soluble canvas is pretty straightforward. Now you want to leave yourself a little bit of extra space, but not too much because the stuff is kind of expensive. And then what we'll do is we'll just cut a piece of it out that'll be big enough to hold our design, plus give us some space around it. And what we're going to be doing is basting this piece of soluble canvas onto the fabric. And then it will act as a guide while we do our cross stitches. Then once we're done, we get it wet and soluble canvas just goes away, leaving the cross stitches on the fabric. So that's the first thing I'm going to do, is baste this canvas onto my project. Now you want it stitched on there securely enough that it will stay on and that it won't move around, but you don't want it super secure because you are going to have to pull these stitches out later. So I'm just starting with a couple of lines of holbein stitch, but then I'm just going to go to a running stitch to go the rest of the way around, just to save future me some headache when I have to pull all of these stitches out. Now make sure not to pull those stitches too tight or it will bubble and warp your fabric. But other than that, it doesn't matter too much what it looks like. While I'm doing that, I want to remind you to join the Caterpillar Cross Stitch Stitch Club email newsletter. You'll get advance notice of any upcoming retreats or projects or socials, stitch-alongs, that kind of stuff. Plus, as soon as you sign up, you'll get an instant download of an ebook with 10 free PDF cross-stitch patterns in it. And those are worth £60 on their own. So hit the link down there in the description or in the first pinned comment on this video so that you can get all those great perks. And there we go. Now, because all of these stitches are temporary and I am going to be pulling them back out later, I don't want to secure it too tightly, just enough to keep it in place while I work. So I'm just going to put a single knot there and then cut that off. Now that I've got my soluble canvas basted onto my working area, I'm going to put the whole thing in an embroidery hoop. That's just to make it a little bit easier for me to hold onto and to make sure that I don't accidentally sew the layers of the garment together. Now it's pretty important to baste the soluble canvas onto your work surface before you stretch it into the hoop, because otherwise your fabric will be stretched when you put it on, and so when you take it off it will unstretch and your stitches will be kind of bubbly and lumpy and have too much slack in them. So you want to baste it on first and then load it into your hoop, whatever, or frame, or whatever you're going to use. And one thing that I'm going to do pretty different with this project from the way I normally advocate cross-stitching is I'm going to use a sharp needle. I'm going to be using either an embroidery needle or a chenille needle, whichever one works better with the fabric that I'm using. But I'm going to need to pierce this fabric, which we don't do with cross-stitching fabric, so I want a sharp needle. A sewing needle has usually a fairly small eye, which makes it hard to get embroidery floss through. So that's why either an embroidery needle or a chenille needle will come in very handy here. So I will just thread up my needle and make my first stitch. Now, because of the tighter weave on this fabric, I'm probably not going to be able to use the loop start from the front technique that I normally would. I am still going to use a loop start, but I will have to start on the back like I used to do. And one nice thing about using loop start, that because this is eventually going to be exposed on the inside of the garment, that's one less tail that could potentially work its way loose eventually. So a loop start gives me a much more secure start to my project. And there are a lot of times when I say that it doesn't matter what the back of your project looks like. But when stitching on a garment like this, that's a time where you probably do want to try to keep your back a little more tidy, because if you have long runs or loose ends or knots that you didn't deal with along the way or something, then that's going to wind up being exposed, and it's going to wind up being a vulnerability in your stitching. You don't want anything that could snag on something or get cut or get torn and make the stitches come undone. One little piece of advice I will give here is that I don't normally care about this, but when I'm stitching on non-cross-stitching fabric, I always try to make sure that as my needle goes through the fabric, it is perpendicular to the surface of the fabric rather than at an angle. Because of the thickness of the fabric, when it comes out the back side, you want it to be consistently coming out in that nice little grid pattern in order to maintain consistent thread length and direction on the back. So I try to make sure to keep my needle perpendicular to the surface of the fabric while doing all of my stitches. It's always fun to try something new, so if you're thinking of starting a new craft altogether, check out Caterpillar Crochet. It's the same beginner-friendly projects and supportive community that you've come to know and love, plus entry-level kits to help you get started. Come find us on Facebook or Instagram to join the group. Okay, now I'm getting kind of close to the end of the first thread that I started with, so I'm going to want to end that thread. Now, when stitching on a garment or anything that's going to be functional, it's especially important not to play thread chicken, because you need to leave yourself some thread to finish it off properly. So I'm going to flip it around to the back side of my project, and I'm going to find a couple of nice tight stitches to tuck that under. Because I want this to be extra secure, I'm also going to actually go back in the other direction and make sure that I pierce through a couple of those threads in the process with my sharp needle. And then pull that nice and tight. So now I want to trim off my tail. One less thing to, it's a strong magnet. One less thing to snag on things. And I'm going to take one extra precaution here. This may not be necessary, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. And that is to put a little bit of fray check on my tail there. Now, I don't want to use enough that it will come through to the front of the fabric, so I'm just going to take a little tiny droplet off of the tip of my bottle and dab that right where I need it so that I'm not staining my piece too much with it. And even given that, I still have a little bit too much, but it shouldn't be noticeable once I finish all the other stitches. If I had been smarter, I would have started with a longer piece of that color so that I could do it all in a single thread and not have an extra tail to deal with. So I'll make sure to do that on the future colors. I learned almost everything I know about cross-stitching actually from the social media groups that I'm in. You can learn so much by being in the Caterpillar Cross Stitch Facebook group and following the Instagram that I can't overstate their value. Find us on Facebook or on Instagram to get started. Now, most of the time you'll probably do something a little bit more elaborate than what I've done here, but I just wanted to do something kind of small for demonstration purposes. So I've completed the little pink heart that I'm going to stitch on here. So now all that remains is to get rid of my soluble canvas. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove my basting stitches. And since I've done them just as a running stitch, I can just pull them out. And I will take my hoop off here because I don't want to get that wet. That will cause it to warp. And then all I need to do is soak this in some warm to hot water for a few minutes, and the soluble canvas should just dissolve away. So I'm going to go do that, and then I'll be right back. Now the package said that it was going to take 5 or 10 minutes in hot water to dissolve that soluble fabric, but I was only using barely warmer than cold water, and it really only took about a minute. And I've dried it most of the way to kind of show you the result here, but that's a pretty neat looking and pretty easy way to use cross stitch to customize clothing or pretty much anything else that you could poke a needle through. Now that is my quick tutorial on how to use water-soluble canvas. This was actually a video in response to a viewer question. If you have a question about cross-stitching that you'd like to see me answer, leave that in the comments down below and I'll add it to my list of ideas. Other than that, I do want to thank you so much for watching. For Caterpillar Cross Stitch, my name is Ford, and I will see you next week.